within this session, we're going to really sort of try and study the importance and relevance of altitude training as a method of training that perhaps more senior, more high-level athletes might use on quite a regular basis if they happen to be an endurance, cardiovascular type athlete. So a couple of key points. I'll come back to these images in a few moments' time. But a couple of things I would like to sort of address. First of all, I'm going to draw some very ropey looking mountain here. I think I've made it some kind of volcano actually with a hollow top. But this mountain, which has got covered in snow up here, the idea of this is that this mountain is going to be something around the 2 kilometer tall mark. So what we're talking there, of course, is 2,000 meter tall. That is a good guideline for the sorts of locations where altitude training becomes relevant. And when we say 2,000 meters, we are talking about a distance of approximately 8,000 feet. Okay, so 8,000 feet of height is the sort of kind of locations we're talking about that may bring about benefits for cardiovascular endurance athletes within altitude training conditions. So the good example of that in Europe is Font Romeu, which is in the Pyrenees mountain range between France and Spain, particularly between the Catalan part of France and the Catalan part of Spain. And it's a really interesting place. I've been near this. I haven't actually been into the town, but I've been near this on a number of locations. Very, very beautiful place. And it is a location that many British, indeed many European athletes use on a regular basis to benefit from this altitude training. So what does it do? Well, I guess some of the most obvious things to say are that at this sort of height, there is less oxygen in the air. Okay, so the air effectively has less oxygen within it. So that in itself is quite an important point. Secondly, because of that, athletes, when they get to altitude, let's talk about this athlete here, for example. This athlete here is Steph Twell, someone I actually know quite well because I used to teach her briefly. But Steph, for example, training at altitude in this particular location, she and the other athletes around her is going to experience a decrease in O2 carrying capacity. So what we mean by that is that because there is less oxygen available in the air, that's going to mean that athletes such as Steph find it harder to consume as much oxygen for the same intensity of exercise. So as a result of that, their oxygen carrying capacity is actually going to decrease at altitude. In other words, their actual performance, their training level may actually initially suffer. And we actually call that process sort of like acclimatization. So we might actually have a suffering of training performance. Okay, now that sounds sort of paradoxical or negative, but it's not when you consider this next point. And this next point is that the body makes up what we might loosely call a compensation. So because of this because of this decrease, in sort of athletic performance, the body compensates, and it compensates, as we've talked about already, through a process of adaptation and changing one's physiology. And in this case, we grow, or we get an increased number, that's an arrow up, believe it or not, of HB. And HB stands for hemoglobin. Let me write it in for you. A couple of different ways of spelling hemoglobin. I'm going to stick with this way. We get an increased quantity of hemoglobin. Those are the iron-rich proteins within the red blood cells which actually carry oxygen. So because there's less oxygen available in the air, the body responds to that by actually growing more red blood cell, hemoglobin-enriched red blood cells, which actually therefore compensate for this decreased oxygen carriage that the athletes are actually undertaking. So that, of course, becomes developmental and beneficial to one's fitness. So a couple of key points. We've said already that this is relevant for endurance athletes. Recognize that there's little significance here for a sprinter, for example. There's not going to be any real benefit for someone who is an explosive, short duration, high intensity type athletes. We can also refer to these athletes, these endurance athletes, as aerobic athletes. Okay, so anything of a long duration, moderate sort of intensity, this is who this is going to be relative for. And it's not a quick process. In fact, it takes in the region of 30 days. So it's a 30-day process. And that's what we're talking about, a 30-day process. So that's what we are interested in. Now then, a couple of other key things before we finish this particular session. I want us to actually look at, perhaps these are some of the benefits. What, though, would be the limitations? So what are the limitations what are the limitations of altitude training? Because it sounds kind of perfect, right? It works, it has the impact. Why is it used less? Why is it maybe a relatively exclusive concept? Well, I guess the first thing to say, of course, because it involves things like travel and living in these places for 30 days, being away and training for a month, it is an expensive experience, right? This is relevant to elite level performers because of the investment required. It's not something that the average kind of marathon fun runner, it's a bit of an odd term, isn't it, fun run through a marathon, but you get my point. The average marathon isn't going to do this because it's too expensive, too exclusive. The other thing about limitations, and we've just touched on this already really, is that when the athlete first gets to altitude, the training intensity drops because their fitness, which gets them a certain intensity of exercise at sea level, actually gets them less intensity at altitude. So training intensity drops initially. We could actually add the word initially to that, and that would be very relevant. So as a result of that, if it's not managed carefully, it can be the case that at least relatively, fitness can be lost. Okay, fitness can be lost. So you can make an argument that the fitness can decrease at altitude, as we just said a moment ago. Some practical issues. You've got the travel time, which is impractical for many. So you've got the impracticality of the travel time. And the other thing is, it tends not to happen at sort of 2,000 meters, but can if you go higher up. We can actually experience in some athletes the idea of altitude sickness. So it's actually so different, the altitude conditions, that people can actually develop a condition called altitude sickness, and it's based on a principle of hypoxia. Hypoxia is effectively getting too little oxygen to the brain because there's less oxygen in the air, and that of course can bring ill health in very serious conditions, not at this sort of height we've been talking about, but in very serious sort of think like well up Everest sort of conditions. It can even cause very serious conditions and even death, so it can be very serious. But hypoxia means that someone can feel relatively unwell when at altitude. And finally, the other thing we've got to say is it's temporary. Okay, so this benefit of growing, developing more red blood cells, it's temporary. In other words, the benefits are lost when back at sea level. So think about then when an athlete would actually go about this altitude training. It would be leading up to something like a big competition, not necessarily the days and weeks, but not necessarily the days before, but certainly within the time period leading up to a big competition, altitude training could well become part of the circumstances by which an endurance, aerobic, long duration athlete might prepare themselves for that competition. Thanks for listening. Have a good day.